The weekend just gone, and we talk about the flooding situation with the Murray River throughout South Australia. It's also a lot of other issues are being centred around Menindee, which is in the far western New South Wales, about 75 k's or 90 k's south of Broken Hill. Still expecting the river to peak there around about 10.5 metres, maybe even a little higher, which would exceed the 1976 flood levels. And the Darling River that flows through that part of the state, feeding into the Menindee Lake system. Then the lower Darling from Menindee flows to Wentworth, and at Wentworth, the Darling meets the Murray. Well, on the weekend, the New South Wales Premier, Dominic Perrottet, Minister for Emergency Services, Steph Cook, were in Menindee. They had a flyover and spoke to a number of people on the ground. With them was the independent member for Barwon. Now, Barwon is the seat that takes in just about all of the far western New South Wales. The independent member for Barwon is Roy Butler. Roy Butler, good morning.
Good morning, Andrew. How are you?
Good, thanks. In light of what happened on the weekend, was it a PR trip, or do you think something's come out of it?
Well, look, the Premier's office contacted me probably a week and a half ago and said, should the Premier go to Menindee? And I said, absolutely. The next question was, should he go during the crisis or after? And I said, I think showing up during the crisis is much better. You're criticised either way, frankly, when you go to these things, because if you show up afterwards, people say, where were you during the event? If you show up during the event, you run the risk of distracting, I suppose, people from doing what they've got to do. But I thought it was important that he did get out there. He's been to a number of other flood-affected communities, and Menindee, whilst it's a fair hike, is no different. It should have the same level of attention. It was, I think, very productive in that the Premier and the Minister got to hear directly from locals, from the combat agencies, about what the challenges they were facing were, what the concerns of the community were, and a lot of that we'd already relayed to the Minister and the Premier, because obviously we speak to people in those communities fairly regularly. But having him out there able to hear for himself and confirm what we'd been telling them was, I think, particularly beneficial in terms of especially those concerns around the changing river height and the predictions. It's clear that there's a deficit in terms of the gauging on the Tully Walker and being able to judge how much water is going to make its way down the system. And that's, I think it's universally agreed, that's one of the reasons why the estimate changed so drastically at short notice. So instead of people having 7 days notice that we could be looking at a very high river, they had sort of 12, 24 hours, which is inadequate and certainly not what the community deserves. And I think the Premier's come away from that, and the Minister's come away from that with a very clear understanding there needs to be better gauging on the Tully Walker, and I suspect we'll see that happen. I've also asked the Premier for a review into how we ended up with advice changing so quickly, and also included in the draft terms of reference that I've given to the Premier and to the Minister. I've asked them to look at the releases in 16-17 because we've never really had a clear answer to how we ended up in that situation where, the lakes at 40% were drained very quickly, and we don't want to see a repeat of that. So, that's within the terms of reference that I've provided as a draft.
I just for the benefit of those people listening this morning, just to overview the situation, is the Darling River, which flows from Burke to Menindee, and once it reaches around the Wilcannia region, the Tully Walker is a creek system that runs fairly well parallel to the Darling River, then rejoins the Darling just north of Menindee. So what we're saying here is the measurements we're taking on the Darling River, which was alerting the people in Menindee what was on the way, but it would appear there was no gauges or no recording of the water in the Tully Walker, which has added to the situation where, as you said, these people were given probably 12 hours notice, which is totally unacceptable.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, with satellite monitoring, with the gauging we've got, and there is some gauging on the Tully Walker that I suspect, and this is what the review will clarify, I suspect that the gauging on the Tully Walker was overwhelmed with the amount of water and couldn't accurately predict the amount of water. So, as I said, the Premier's come away and the Minister's come away with a very clear picture that the gauging is inadequate that's on the Tully Walker, and there needs to be a much better understanding of how much water is in the creek and on the floodplain, so that residents of Menindee, and it's not just Menindee, because obviously while we're releasing 75,000 megalitres, that's 75,000 gig a day out of Menindee, that also impacts downstream. And we had local government representatives from Wentworth Shire who were up in Menindee on the day that the Premier Premier and the Minister were there, who are already being impacted by floodwater, and that's going to continue while the releases are that high. The releases at this stage are slightly higher than the inflows, which is a good sign, because what that means is more water's getting out than is coming in, and that needs to happen to make sure that obviously Menindee town stays safe. Those low-lying areas around Menindee, Racecourse Road and Irrigation Road, there's a lot of properties, probably. I mean, there's different numbers floating around because if you include the out-of-town properties, there's probably about 100 that are impacted in town. The number seems to be about 30 that are impacted with different levels of overflow inundation. So, again, more warning, better data leads to better decisions, and I think that the Minister and the Premier had a very clear understanding after being in India that that's what the community expects and also what needs to happen.
And I no doubt there's probably people sitting in South Australia listening this morning thinking, well, once all that water that's emptying out of the Menindee Lakes reaches Wentworth, then merges with the Murray River, and what sort of impact that may have in weeks to come on the Murray system. Has that been discussed at any level that you're aware of?
Look, yeah, it certainly has. Obviously, the Murray system is outside of my electorate, but I have been keeping an eye on some of the media and some of the talk that's going on. I mean, it's a double-edged sword, Andrew, isn't it? I mean, we've been trying to keep the Murray mouth open for years with dredges, and what that needs to happen naturally is a massive amount of water, and that's happening at the moment. So that's got the opportunity to naturally push that sand out and reopen the Murray mouth, which is a positive thing. But obviously along the way, when you've got really high rivers, properties are going to be impacted, agriculture is going to be impacted, communities are going to be impacted, and that's the downside. But there's always two sides to these things. But in terms of Menindee, we're still heading towards potentially 10.7. That's still the official number that we're potentially heading towards. I think today we're at 10.25. It'll just be interesting to see how it plays out. But there's stuff that we can't fix right now, like we can't fix the advice that we had in the lead-up. We can't fix the roads until the water's gone. But in terms of making it really clear to the Premier and to the Minister that those are things that we need to focus on, that was certainly my priority in getting them out there, that we need to make sure that there's better advice, there's better data, and the roads are something that it comes up everywhere we go, or everywhere I go, especially. Central Darling Shire is the largest LGA in the state with the smallest rate base. They've got 2,700 kilometres of unsealed roads that need to be repaired. And over years, what's happened is grading of the roads has generally lowered the level of the road, as opposed to building a crown and building mitre drains to get water off the road. So our roads tend to, especially in low-lying areas, turn into rivers as opposed to being roads. And that just makes it harder to get them back to being functional roads again when the water dissipates. So that's something that, again, I've consistently raised with the Premier. There's $550 million in total on the table at the moment for road repair. But as I've said in the press conference in Menindee, that's going to be in the billions across regional New South Wales. $550 million a start, but it's not going to get us there. Our councils have limited capacity. There's only so many road crews you've got, and there's only so many hours a day you can work them. At the moment in New South Wales, you can't hire or buy a grader for love nor money. Because they're not available because they're all out being used. Transport for New South Wales has put an extra 200 road crews out, which is positive. But again, it comes down to how quickly they can do that work, and I suppose the quality of the work too. We want to make sure we're not just patching holes. We want to build roads better than they were, so our communities aren't cut off for as long. And that goes all the way from the Queensland border all the way down to the Victorian border. We want to make sure that communities aren't cut off for as long as they were in this particular event, because some of our communities, couldn't get fuel in, couldn't get food in unless it was brought in by helicopter, which obviously for some of our communities is not a very good way to have things when you can't even get fuel into your community.
We're talking to Roy Butler, who's independent member for Barwon. Barwon is the state seat of the far west of New South Wales. Just quickly, I'll throw this last one at you then. So when the Premier's on the ground, Dominic Perrottet in India on the weekend, along with the Minister for Emergency Services, I know a lot of locals and probably in the Central Darling Shire were probably expecting him to make some sort of announcement in terms of funding to repair infrastructure once that water starts to subside. And we know the $500 million on the table has been there for a while now for roads and potholes. But were you a little bit disappointed that he didn't make some sort of specific announcement on the weekend?
So the first announcement was 50 million, which was woefully inadequate. We all knew that. The next announcement, which was probably a week ago, was 500 million for roads, and they've got the mechanism now for councils to apply for that. In terms of the future announcements, I can guarantee you there will be future announcements for repairing infrastructure, repairing roads. I've made it really clear to the Premier that, and I said it in the press conference, and he was standing behind me, and I think in the audio you can actually hear him agreeing with me. The $550 million isn't going to cut it. There's going to need to be more. But what needs to happen is the federal government needs to kick the tin as well. At this stage, the states put $550 million on the table, which is positive. But when the repair bill is going to be in the billions, we need the federal government to kick the tin as well. There will be future announcements in terms of infrastructure repair, road repair, and that will come. But obviously we want to make sure that happens before we hit the blackout period of January the 26th, where basically government grinds to a halt in the lead up to the state election. So I'll be continuing to talk to the Premier, talk to the Minister about making sure that those announcements are happening. The other thing I really want to see, Andrew, and this is something that, again, is in the pipeline and will come, I was hoping it was going to be announced on Saturday. Unfortunately, they weren't ready to announce it, is a review into, as I said, how we ended up in a situation where we don't have adequate gauging, where we don't have adequate advice, where our combat agencies are sort of left reeling by last-minute advice about changing river heights. That's something that needs to be understood better. There needs to be a proper inquiry and investigation into it so that those recommendations can then inform the flood management plan for the Central Darling Shire, which is funded, and that will then make the flood management plan for Central Darling Shire and the town of Menindee a far more robust and meaningful document.
Roy Butler, we have to leave it there. Thank you for your time.
No worries, Andrew. Thank you.
Independent member for Barwon. As I said, it's the state seat in New South Wales. It takes in the far west